Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to class. The essay that we will be dealing with today is the essay number 84 and it was published in the Spectator on the 6th of June 1711. In the last class I told you that there were many essays that we were going to do from the Spectator, and regardless of the numbers going back and forth, we were going to do a few more essays written by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. Now the essay that we'll be dealing with today is slightly different in nature, in the sense that there is not that directness of purpose that Addison and Steele have so far shown. So in that sense, this essay is going to be slightly different. It's not so much to the point as in the previous essays, and the best example that I can give you is that the essays that we've done so far, the very first paragraph that happens to be the introductory paragraph tells you what the rest of the essay is going to be about. So this is an essay that's going to be slightly different in the sense that it talks about characters which do not appear to have been taken out of contemporary court life or from history. In fact, the characters that are being discussed in this essay in a lot of detail are more legendary than historical characters. But we'll discuss that in greater detail as we go on with the essay. So without further ado, let us launch into essay number 84 and see what Mr. Spectator has for us in this essay. As is usual, the essay begins with a quotation from Virgil, and it's a rather longish quotation. Let me translate this for you. I witnessed that tragedy myself, and I took a great part in the events. No one could tell the tale and refrain from tears, not even if he were a Myrmidon or a Dolopian, that is, members of the Greek tribe, or some soldiers of the unpitying Ulysses. Virgil, you know, wrote the Aeneid, which was patterned on the Odyssey written by Homer. So Virgil, following the great master and his work, the Odyssey, wrote the Aeneid, which recounts the exploits and adventures of Aeneas. So what he is talking about here is something to which he was an eyewitness. So he says it's not something that other people told him about, or that he heard from someone else and therefore there was doubt regarding its authenticity. This is something that the poet has observed himself. So whatever he's going to be talking about, it's not the story of mythical creatures or legendary figures. This is something that he has observed himself, and therefore he is recounting it now. Now what exactly it is that he recounts, we're going to find out in a minute or two. Let us move on from the translation of the Latin quotation, which, as you are familiar by now, is the accepted form of beginning an essay. The previous essays from the Spectator that we discussed in class also invariably began with a Latin quotation. In some cases, these were Latin quotes which had been taken from the original in Greek. So, keeping in tune with the spirit of the age, which was known as the Age of Reason, the spirit of the age is the neoclassical spirit, and in this, the writers who are writing during this time, they go back for their motivation and inspiration to the classics, to the Greeks and the Romans. All right? So, without further ado, let us commence with the essay. Mr. Spectator says, looking over the old manuscript wherein the private actions of Pharamond are set down by way of table book, I found many things which gave me great delight. And as human life turns upon the same principles and passions in all ages, I thought it very proper to take minutes of what passed in that age for the instruction of this age, the Age of Reason, the age in which Addison and Steele lived and had their being, moved in the court, did various tasks, made various presentations in the court, and generally represented the aristocracy of the Restoration age and afterwards. So he says, when I was going through some old manuscripts, some old books, and I came upon this story of Pharamond, and I'm going to mention this because history repeats itself. Now, what the writer is trying to convey in this essay is that what has happened in the past is repeated in the present and will be repeated in the future, because he says human life turns upon the same principles and passions in all ages. Human beings have not changed. Human beings by nature are the same. They were the same in the days of Adam and Eve. They are the same now. So emotions, sentiments, thoughts, ideas, they have not changed. Time has changed, yes, but essentially speaking, human nature, human temperament have stayed the same. So, keeping this in mind, the writer says that I picked up the story of Pharamond. Now, Pharamond is in some places termed as the first king of the Franks. In other places, he has different references that are given. And when you read through all these references, the idea that the reader gathers is that Pharamond was not so much a historical figure as a legendary figure, kind of like King Arthur. You know, there are a lot of stories are associated with King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And there is a lot of evidence to show that King Arthur actually existed. But whether he did everything that is associated with him or not is a different thing altogether. There are certain things that might have happened, certain others which it is very difficult to believe actually did take place. So just as with the legend of King Arthur, so it is with the legend of Pharamond. And the writer studies the legend of Pharamond because he believes that human beings have not changed. Their passions, sentiments, emotions, thoughts, ideas, feelings, they have stayed the same throughout history. And therefore, he takes a special pleasure, as he says, it gives me great delight to delve into the past, and by relating stories from the past to find equivalence in the present time. So that what he's trying to do is to take up a story from the past, pick up a moral out of that story and apply it to the present situation. So according to him, human nature has not changed. Human beings have stayed the same, and therefore the way that human beings reacted 5,000 years ago is no different from the way human beings are reacting in the 18th century, or as they will in the 25th century, okay, which you and I may not live to see. So that is the reason why he is delving into the legend of Pharamond. The antiquary who lent me these papers gave me a character of Eucrate, whose name actually means power well used, who happened to be the favorite of Pharamond, and extracted from an author who lived in that court. So he's trying to establish the validity of this document. He has this manuscript which the person who lent it to the writer had received from the author in the court. Now this takes us back in history, and not just in history but in mythology also, because if you remember, I just told you that Pharamond is more a legendary figure than an actual person, and in order to lend validity to his argument, the writer says that, you know, the person who gave me this, his special area of interest is old stories, old tales. He calls him an antiquarian, a person who deals with antiques. So this manuscript, this very valuable document, is a true narrative of what happened in the court of Pharamond. And in order to sort of establish the validity of the writer, the essayist says that the name of this person around whom the entire essay focuses was Eucrate, and his name translated means power well used. So what he's trying to do is establish the validity of the document by telling us about the author. Okay, now you need to keep in mind the fact that in one of the previous classes I mentioned that it is not enough for a reader to just read the text. The reader also wants to know who the author was, what his situation was like in terms of his social status, his economic position, etc., etc. So now also he says that I know who the author was, and based on that knowledge we can say that whatever has been related in this manuscript is true, is factual. Okay, so he says, I am going to talk about the court of Pharamond and the relationship between Pharamond and Eucrate, because he says that I may have occasion to mention many of their conversations, into which these memorials of them may give light. So I'm going to take examples from the court of Pharamond and see how far it applies to the present situation, to the 18th century, maybe to the court of King William III and Queen Mary II, maybe to the court of Queen Anne. So regardless of time, he says human beings, essentially speaking, have not changed at all. So he's delving into the story because he wants us to know about these two characters whom he might be referring to in the later essays also. Pharamond, and now he is going to explain one particular occasion, the events that took place on one such day. And he says, Pharamond, when he had a mind to retire for an hour or two from the hurry of business and fatigue of ceremony, made a signal to Eucrate by putting his hand to his face placing his arm negligently on a window, or some such action as appeared indifferent to all the rest of the company. Okay, now here you have a king who is a legendary king, but a king nonetheless, and his name is Pharamond. And Pharamond and his favorite courtier, that is Eucrate, have a kind of code that they have established. You know what a code is? Sign language. Some secret gesture which the general public will not be able to understand. So Pharamond and Eucrate had this signal, this cue that the king would give to his favorite, and depending on how soon the favorite understood and interpreted the cue, they would act upon it. And what they were going to do, I'm going to tell you in a little while. Now, the king is a busy man, and Pharamond was a very busy person. And yet, since he was a good king, he wanted to have dealings with his subjects, with the population of his country. Now, a busy person who's ruling a country would not ordinarily have time for the general public. But Pharamond, as the legendary king, still has what you and I would call a one-to-one correspondence with his subjects, with the population of his state. And because he wanted to have this direct coordination, Pharamond and Eucrate, his favorite courtier, had set up a series of signals. So what he would do is he would put his hand to his face in a particular manner, maybe like this, maybe like so. You know, it could be any one of a dozen different gestures. He'd do that, and maybe he'd put his arm on the window, but it was a signal that the king was tired, and the king wanted to leave the court and at the same time to establish contact with the common people. And this is the pattern that they had established. Now, this was a series of signals that nobody else could understand. Only Eucrate could understand, and what Eucrate would do is he would absent himself from the court and go to his apartment, so go to his room. This was a signal that the king wanted to say something in private to his favorite courtier, who happened to be Eucrate. So Eucrate would quickly hurry to his apartment because he knew that the king would be arriving in the next few minutes. There was a secret access to this part of the court at which Eucrate used to admit many whose mean appearance in the eyes of the ordinary waiters and doorkeepers made them be repulsed from other parts of the palace. Such as these were let in here by order of Eucrate and had audiences of Pharamond. How easy is it for an ordinary human being to see the king? And not only to see the king as in the king is passing by and you're standing there. No. To see the king and to convey his grievances, to convey the issues that are in the mind of the general public. Pharamond had fixed up this particular way of talking to the general public and trying to find out what exactly was the matter. Now, the point that he makes here is that Euclid would bring in people who were not from the rich class, who were obviously poor. They still had issues that needed to be discussed, and they would come to the palace gates and not allowed to enter the palace gates. Have you heard that story where the nobleman dresses in the clothes of a beggar and goes to a party where he has been invited? And the man at the doorway says, "I'm sorry, you cannot enter. You are wearing such dirty clothes." He doesn't recognize the man. He doesn't recognize the nobleman. And so the nobleman goes back and he wears his fine clothes and he comes back to the same place, and the doorman, the guard, says, "Welcome, sir. We have been waiting for you. Please, won't you sit here? Will you not take some drinks? Will you not eat?" And when the man sits down to eat, what does he do? Yes, he puts food inside his sleeve. He picks up his collar and puts food there. And he says, "Eat, sleeve, for you have been invited, not I." So his clothes determine his status in society. We are talking about people who were not allowed to enter the palace, and yet they get to speak to the king, they get to share their concerns with the king. What a wonderful opportunity to put your concerns across to your king. What a very wonderful idea. So coming back to the Spectator, this is the kind of person that Euclid would bring to the king. So people who in the normal course of events did not have access to the king, Euclid would pick up these people and take them to his own apartment. And when the king grew tired of his courtiers praising him all the time, the king would make a signal and Euclid would come back to his apartment, where he would be followed by the king, and the king would then hear what the common people had to say, because the king got tired of what his courtiers had to say. The courtiers obviously are always applauding, tuck, tuck, tuck. This is what they do. This is what they've been trained to do. Whatever the king says, the courtier says, "Yes, your highness, yes, your majesty." Pharamond did not want that. Pharamond wanted to know if his people were suffering, that this suffering should be done away with. What they were disturbed with would have to be improved. So Pharamond, in an attempt to establish one-to-one coordination with his nation, had such people brought to the apartments of Euclid, not to his court, otherwise everybody would come to the court. So these are people whom Euclid would select and would then keep in his apartment until the proper time, and then he would introduce them to the king. The entrance Pharamond called the gate of the unhappy, and the tears of the afflicted who came before him, he would say, were bribes received by Euclid. For Euclid had the most compassionate spirit of all men living, except his generous master, who was always kindled at the least affliction which was communicated to him. So Pharamond basically had a soft heart, just as Euclid did. And Pharamond frequently referred to the fact that he could not turn away from tears. Tears were the bribe. So obviously these poor people, when they came to Pharamond, they had tears in their eyes because they were troubled. They were bothered. So for Pharamond, they acted as a bribe. You know, if he saw a person weeping, he would deal with him first and a non-weeping person later on, because his major concern was to alleviate the sufferings of the poor. So Euclid had a very generous heart. He was very soft-hearted, and his soft-heartedness and his kindness and generosity were only outdone by his master, that is his king, Pharamond. In the regard for the miserable, Euclid took particular care that the common forms of distress and the idle pretenders to sorrow about courts who wanted only supplies to luxury should never obtain favor of his master. So Euclid was not just a very sensitive soul, he was also a very intelligent person, and he didn't bring in people who just wanted the king to provide them with the luxuries of life. Those are not the kind of people that he was bothered with. He was not there to provide the luxuries of life for them. He was there to serve his people, to serve humanity, to serve his nation. And so he chose these people very carefully, because after all, these people were going to be introduced to the king. So he was not easily taken in. But the distresses which arise from the many inexplicable occurrences that happen among men, the unaccountable alienation of parents from their children, cruelty of husbands to wives, poverty occasioned from shipwreck or fire, the falling out of friends, or such other terrible disasters to which the life of man is exposed. So the things that concerned him were, if there was a gap between the way that the parents thought and the way that the children thought, if there was a sudden disaster which resulted in poverty on a very big scale, if there were friends who had fallen out, who had become enemies, who were no longer on talking terms, etc., etc., such cases Euclid would bring to Pharamond. So the kind of people that Euclid would bring into the presence of Pharamond were not ordinary beggars. They were not the kind of people who would, let's say, who just wanted money. These were people who wanted resolution, who wanted solutions to issues that they had. So in cases of this nature, Euclid was the patron and enjoyed this part of the royal favor so much without being envied that it was never inquired into by whose means what no one else cared for doing was brought about. So he did such a lot of good work that he was known as patron of the unhappy, and he was given a lot of power by the king, with the result that no one asked him who had given him authority to bring these people to the palace, whom the ordinary guards would not allow to enter the gates of the palace, and they came into a place where they would meet the king. So nobody asked him, partly because it was known that he was a great favorite with the king, and partly because people were glad that there was someone who took active interest in trying to resolve the problems of the poor people. One evening, when Pharamond came into the apartment of Euclid, he found him extremely dejected, upon which he asked, with a smile which was natural to him. So Pharamond is not the kind of grim, sober, serious king. He's a king who is good-natured. So he asked Euclid, with a smile, What, is there anyone too miserable to be relieved by Pharamond that Eucrate is melancholy? Is there a person whose problems Pharamond cannot resolve, and that has made Eucrate so melancholy, so sad? In other words, what he's trying to say is, I'm the king. You must trust me to do the best. And when you trust me, I will resolve all your problems regardless of the number of problems or the intensity of problems that are brought to me. So he says, why is Eucrate dejected? Is it because there is a problem that Pharamond cannot resolve? And how is that possible? I am the king. So, in other words, what he's saying is, I shall resolve everything. You don't need to weep. So when Pharamond asked this question, this is how Eucrate responded. I fear there is a person without of a good air, well dressed, and though a man in the strength of his life, seems to faint under some inconsolable calamity. All his features seem suffused with agony of mind, but I can observe in him that is more inclined to break away in tears than rage. I asked him what he would have. He said he would speak to Pharamond. I desired his business. He could hardly say to me, Eucrate, carry me to the king. My story is not to be told twice. I fear I shall not be able to speak it at all. So, when Pharamond asks Eucrate, what is the matter? Eucrate says, I'm afraid that there is a problem that you may not be able to resolve. Because the person who has come to me is not of poor means. He is well dressed. He appears to be from a good background. And he is so full of emotions that it is difficult for him to speak. When I said, tell me your problem, and he said, no, take me to the king. Because if I tell you the story, I have to tell the story again to the king. And I am so upset, I don't think I can relate the story twice. So that makes Eucrate very upset, because he wonders what it is that has made this person, who appears to come from a good, noble family, he's well dressed, what is it that is bothering him? And so he says, I'm afraid, sir, there is a problem that even you may not be able to resolve, because I have not been able to make anything out of this man. He appears well dressed, he appears to be from a good family, but he is very emotional, and he is not angry. He is weeping, and when he speaks, it is as if his voice is going to break. So Pharamond is very upset, and let's see what he tells Eucrate. So he commanded Eucrate to let him enter, and this is the individual who is weeping and who says he wants to see the king. He did so, and the gentleman approached the king with an air which spoke him under the greatest concern in what manner to demean himself. The king, who had a quick discerning, relieved him from the oppression he was under, and with the most beautiful complacency said to him, Sir, do not add to that load of sorrow I see in your countenance, the awe of my presence. Think you are speaking to your friend. If the circumstances of your distress will admit of it, you shall find me so. Okay, so Pharamond commands, orders Eucrate to bring in this gentleman, and when the gentleman is brought in, he approaches the king in a manner which he's abasing himself before the king, and because Pharamond was used to dealing with his subjects under a lot of strain, he at once makes his tone very, very soft and compassionate, and tells the gentleman to consider him as a friend. Now this is a big thing. The king telling one of his subjects, I am your friend, tell me what is it that is bothering you. That is what sort of puts his subjects at ease, and allows them to relieve themselves of the burden that they have been carrying. So the stranger, this gentleman who told Euclid that he could only tell his story once, this is how he then responds. O excellent Pharamond, named not a friend to the unfortunate Spinamond. I had one, but he is dead by my own hand. But O Pharamond, though it was by the hand of Spinamond, it was by the guilt of Pharamond. I come not, O excellent prince, to implore your pardon. I come to relate my sorrow, a sorrow too great for human life to support. So the gentleman starts off this long speech, and it's a speech that's slightly complicated because he doesn't come to the point at once. Now, you need to remember that he is in the presence of his king, and as such, there is a certain etiquette that must be observed. In spite of the fact that Pharamond says, consider me your friend, do not think that I am your king, I am here to resolve your problems. So confide in me, have confidence in me, because I will solve your problem. And when Pharamond says this, this gentleman who is very much upset responds and says, it's very difficult for me to relate my issue, because although this is something that you confide in your friends and you are my king, I am forced to confide in you because I do not have a friend anymore. And the reason is, I have killed my friend. Now, before you start asking, how did he kill him? Why did he kill him? Let us see what this gentleman has to say. From henceforth shall all occurrences appear dreams or short intervals of amusement. From this one affliction which has seized my very being, pardon me, O Pharamond, if my griefs give me leave that I lay before you in the anguish of a wounded mind, that you, good as you are guilty of the generous blood spilt this day by this unhappy hand. Oh, that it had perished before that instant. All right, let's go back. Now, it appears that the man who is called Spinamond or Spinamon has killed his friend. That's simple enough, and that is something that you can extract out of this long speech that he makes, where he says, oh, you exalted creature, oh my king, this is the problem that I have. And it doesn't come about the problem quickly. He does it in a very roundabout way. And you need to keep in mind the fact that this was how things were done in the days when you had kings and queens having their court and having all the lords and ladies coming one by one and saying things in a very roundabout manner, making first a beautiful speech and then telling them what the problem was. This was the manner that was adopted, this was the manner that was accepted, and this is the manner that you see Spinamont using here. So he says, you know, good as you are my king, but you are guilty of having killed my friend. This is the hand that held the weapon, and yet you are guilty. Now what he's trying to say here is that although he has killed his friend, he is not responsible for the killing. It is the king who is responsible. And we'll see why he holds the king responsible. There is an authority due to distress, and as none of human race is above the reach of sorrow, none should be above the hearing the voice of it. I am sure Pharamond is not. Again, you see, he's going in a roundabout way. He's not coming to the point directly. He goes round and round, and then he gets to what he's actually trying to say. So what he's trying to say is, we are all human beings. You are a human being before you're a king, and therefore you should be able to hear my sorrow. Although I have killed my friend, you are responsible. And the reason why he holds the king responsible is something that goes into history. You've heard what dueling is. You've heard what fencing is. Now, a duel was fought when a gentleman, mostly a nobleman, thought that he had been insulted by another nobleman or by another gentleman. And in the medieval times, duels were fought with swords. So you would have each person given a sword, and you would fight, you know, going tissue, tissue, and the person who was killed was thought to have died an honorable death. Fast forward to the 18th century, and you have the same duel being fought over tiny things. No longer is it your honor that is being questioned. It could be something very small, a tiny debt that has to be repaid, some joke that somebody has cracked, and the other person would take offense and say, all right, such and such a time, I want to meet you outside the palace gates, or I want to meet you in the center of the village green, and you would have the two people going there, and you would have maybe one or two friends who would go there, so that they were witnesses. Now, what happened was that Spinamon had killed his friend. He was a very, very dear friend. But he holds the king responsible because he says that dueling should not be legal. It is because you as king have allowed dueling that my friend is dead today. If you had not allowed it, my friend would still be living. So he is holding the king responsible because there was a law that said if a gentleman were insulted, he would have to avenge his honor. What kind of an honor is being talked about here? Now that is something that we perhaps living in Pakistan can understand very easily, because for us honor is a very big thing. But what Spinamont is trying to emphasize here is what people in Pakistan have also tried to emphasize. The educated people have tried to emphasize the fact that what goes on in the name of honor killings should be banned. A stop should be put to it. As long as society considers this as something good, there will be no dearth of people being killed who are innocent. So what he's talking about here is a duel that he fought with his best friend, and it resulted in the death of his best friend. So he says, know then that I have this morning unfortunately killed in a duel the man whom of all men living I loved most. I command myself too much in your royal presence to say, Pharamond, give me my friend. Pharamond has taken him from me. So he's accusing the king of having taken his friend's life. I will not say, shall the merciful Pharamond destroy his own subjects? Will the father of his country murder his people? But the merciful Pharamond does destroy his subjects. The father of his country does murder his people. Fortune is so much the pursuit of mankind that all glory and honor is in the power of a prince, because he has the distribution of their fortunes. It is therefore the inadvertency, negligence or guilt of princes to let anything grow into custom which is against their laws. A court can make fashion and duty walk together. It can never without the guilt of a court happen that it shall not be unfashionable to do what is unlawful. But alas, in the dominions of Pharamond, by the force of a tyrant custom, which is misnamed a point of honor, the duelist kills his friend whom he loves, and the judge condemns the duelist while he approves his behavior. Now, if we go back a bit, he says, you are guilty of having killed my friend. You are the king. You make the laws. You implement the laws. You are our king. You are the father. How can a father kill his own children? But that is what has happened. You have allowed a law to be made out of honor killings. There is a point of honor, and you as king provide protection to this killing. He calls it a tyrant custom, a savage custom. It is misnamed a point of honor. There is no honor involved here. It's killing, but it's killing which the law allows. So the duelist kills his friend. The law then gives punishment to the duelist. So what has happened? What has happened is that one man has been killed, the other is punished because the other will be thrown into jail. Okay? So shame is the greatest of all evils. What avail laws when death only attends the breach of them, and shame obedience to them? As for me, O Pharamond, were it possible to describe the nameless kinds of compunctions and tendernesses I feel when I reflect upon the little accidents in our former familiarity, my mind swells into sorrow which cannot be resisted enough to be silent in the presence of Pharamond. Now, what he's trying to say here is that shame is the greatest of all evils. Now, when he says shame is the greatest of all evils, he's actually referring to a law that this legendary king Pharamond passed. And according to this law, and in an attempt to control this dueling, to control these honor killings, it had been passed and it was implemented. And the law stated that if a man were killed in a duel, his property would pass on to the state, and the person who killed in the duel, he would be punished by having his property confiscated and passed on to the next of kin, to his heir, in the same way as if that man had also died. So what it comes down to is that the two persons who are fighting the duel, their property would pass on to their heirs. Now, the problem with this law arose, and the point that this gentleman has to contend is that as far as the person who was dead was concerned, it was okay. His property, his wealth passed on to his next of kin. But what happened was that the person who remained, his property was also transferred to his heir. Now he's still living, but the courts decide that he is no longer capable of taking care of his property. So his property, his money, his wealth would pass on to his heir. Now the law was made to put a stop to dueling. It did not. Dueling continued. But the idea that even if you survived the duel, your property would pass on to your next of kin, this was enough of a damper. As he says, shame is the greatest of all evils. It is embarrassing to be alive and not to be in control of your property, your wealth. And so he says, I'm alive, my friend is dead, I wish I had died in my friend's place. But the point of honor was that we fight a duel, and so we fought, and so I killed my friend. But you as king are as responsible for the death of my friend as this hand. And he's so upset at the death of his friend that he says, I would that my hand had been cut off, because I loved my friend so much, and yet I cannot bring him back to life. And as if that is not enough, you have inflicted a further punishment on me. And this punishment is in the form of shame. I'm alive. Is it not enough that I am alive and my friend is dead, but that your law must rob me of all my money, all my property? This is something that is inexcusable. So, I am so upset, I am so sorrowful that I cannot remain silent in the presence of my king. With that he fell into a flood of tears and wept aloud. Why should not Pharamond hear the anguish he only can relieve others from in time to come? Let him hear from me what they feel who have given death by the false mercy of his administration, and formed to himself the vengeance called for by those who have perished by his negligence. Now what he is trying to say here is a rather strange idea, and you have to remember that in writing this, the aim of the essayist is to bring to light a matter that is very frequently ignored and to find some resolution to this matter. So once he has told his story, once he has told the king how upset he is, he weeps aloud and he says, "You are the king, you are our father. How is it that you do not know what your children are going through? How is it that you are not aware of what sufferings your subjects are enduring by the passing of this law? One man is dead because you allow dueling." And then the court says that the survivor must have all his property and wealth forfeited and transferred to the next of kin. The man who is dead dies because this honor killing is encouraged. The man who lives is punished because all his worldly possessions are taken away from him. So the man who is living in truth also dies, because as he says, shame is the greatest of all evils. Death can be excused. Shame, embarrassment, loss of face, loss of property is something that is very difficult to endure. Before we wind up today's lesson, I'd like you to remember that this is the time in which Alexander Pope wrote The Rape of the Lock. And those of you who have gone through the text of The Rape of the Lock will know that during this time, appearances had become so important that if words uttered were perceived as insults, that point became a point of honor. And if you remember the story of the rape of the lock, it is a lock of hair that had been cut from the head of a society beauty. And this lock of hair became a matter of a feud between two families. And Alexander Pope, in order to diffuse tensions, in order to reconcile the two families, wrote the poem in an attempt to make those families realize how unimportant this issue was, how insignificant it was, and how it had been blown out of all proportions. So Pope, Addison and Steele, they were living and writing in the same age, and so their concerns were similar. If Pope was writing in verse, the same thing Addison and Steele were writing about in the form of essays that were being published in the Spectator. Pope wrote the poem to diffuse the tensions between the two families and to bring those two families together, to reconcile them. Addison and Steele were writing to point out small things which had been blown out of all proportion, which had become great issues. And people were suffering because of that. People were being killed on what appeared to be a point of honor. So if someone does not like the way I dress and passes a comment on my dress, is that reason for me to say, all right, we're going to meet in such and such a place and we are going to decide who is right. This is a point of honor for me. And I'm going to have your blood for this. And so then we go out and we fight it out with swords, with guns. That is not the way civilized people behave. That's not the way educated people behave. That is the way that things are decided in the jungle. Might is right. Only the fittest can survive. So when this gentleman, Spinamond, he comes before Pharamond and he weeps and he cries and he tells the king, this is what is happening in your country, in your presence, under your rule. This must be stopped. What the essayist is trying to say is, there are laws which have been made, laws which are being implemented, but which need to be revised, which need to be, if possible, done away with totally, so that there is no point of honor, there is no dueling, there is no penalty to the person who survives. These are things that must be done away with totally, once and for all. And unless you as king make an attempt to do away with all of this, we, your subjects, cannot hope for any light at the end of this tunnel. We are living in darkness and we shall continue to live in darkness if these laws are not repealed, if these conditions do not change. Let us quickly recap what we have discussed today. In the beginning, the essay starts off by saying that this is a story which I know to be true, and it is the story of Pharamond and Eucrit. And Pharamond, you know, was more a legendary king than a person who actually existed. And the story is told of the court of Pharamond, where he says that he sees his favorite courtier upset, and he says, what is it that you are so upset about? Why can you not confide in me? Is it something that I cannot resolve? And Eucrit says, maybe it is, because under the agreement that the king has with Eucrit, people who are ordinarily not allowed into the palace, they come to Eucrit if they have problems, and Eucrit manages a one-to-one audience with the king, where the king resolved the issues of the common people, because he was a good king and his aim was to provide solace to the downtrodden. So anyone who was in any trouble came to Eucrit, and Eucrit sought an audience with the king, and these people could then tell their whole story to the king, with the king resolving the issue. But this person who has come, Eucrit says, is not ready to tell him his story. He says, I'll only tell the king. And the story turns out to be one that is really very scary, because this man, Spinamond, had killed his best friend, the only person he loved in the world, in a duel, because it was considered a point of honor. And not only did he lose his friend, but he also lost all his wealth, his property, because the court passed or implemented the law that said that the person who died in the duel, his property was going to pass on to his heir anyway, but the person who survives the duel, his property, his wealth, is also transferred to his heir, and it was thought that by passing this judgment people would stop fighting duels. But what Spinamont is trying to say here is that that is not the way that you put a stop to this senseless killing. The only way that it can be stopped is by abolishing dueling altogether, by abolishing this honor killing totally and absolutely, once and forever. You cannot allow it to go on and penalize both parties. That's not the way good kings rule. So the aim of writing this entire conversation and describing this this meeting between Pharamond and Spinamont is that such things were happening in society. Although it was known as the age of reason, such unreasonable things actually happen in society. They were allowed to happen, and in writing about this, what Addison and Steele are trying to tell us is that these things need to be condemned totally. You cannot allow it and also penalize those who participate in it. There has to be a law which will say that there will be no dueling. That's all for today. Thank you very much for being patient. Allah Hafiz.